All right, we here are going to be looking at how to create a snowman, a basic snowman in 3D Studio. So after an introduction to 3D Studio, a common thing that you might want to do is make a snowman because it has a lot of primitive objects but allows you to play around with all the tools. So the basic snowman we're going to make is one with 3 snowballs, a top hat, a couple of stick arms, some buttons, as well as a smile, a carrot nose, and some eyes. So I may or may not finish the whole thing, but it'll give you an introduction to kind of the interface and some of the things to be aware of as we're going through this. So a few things to be aware of. You may want to turn on the angle snap toggle, which is a button up here. It allows you to make sure that when you rotate, you're rotating by 5 degrees. You may also want to, by perspective, turn on your edged faces. That's more important in other types of elements of 3D Studio, but it's a good practice anyways. All right, so let's go ahead and start by making the snowballs. Now I'm going to go to sphere. And I find that often, especially as we move forward, it's good to use the top view, but you can use any view you want to make your sphere. I'm going to go into the top view. Okay, so I'm going to make a sphere. There it is. Now off to the right-hand side, you can actually change the colors of your objects. That's right here. So you can go to your color picker, and I'm just going to make that snowball white. Now you may recall that in order to duplicate an object, you go to the Move tool, you hold down Shift on your keyboard, and you drag your snowball upwards, depending on which axis you grab. But I'm going to grab the Y-axis, hold down Shift, drag upwards, and there we go. Now the other thing I want to do is scale it smaller, so I can go to my Scale tool, go into the middle of the Scale tool so it doesn't scale it on just one axis. You want to scale the whole thing smaller, and maybe from one of the front or side views you can now notice the size of it, go to your Move tool again, and move it down so that it's actually touching the previous snowball. So I can do the same thing again. I'm just going to duplicate this upwards again. There we go. And scale it down. And move that guy down right there. So that's probably the quickest way. There's many other ways. You can even see from the top-down view. This is a nice, accurate way that I've done it. If you do it from other views, it might not be perfectly done. There has been occasions when students think it looks good from the perspective view, but when they rotate, they notice that it's not actually looking good. So also make sure in the perspective view you're rotating. Okay? All right, so moving next. Let's go ahead and try the top hat here. So I'm going to go to Cylinder. And from the top view, I can kind of see the circumference of the smallest sphere here. So I'm going to go to the middle of the top view and just make a cylinder. Okay, I'll make it a little bit bigger than his head. And you can even see, I'll maybe do a bad job of it. You can see from the side view here that brim of a top hat would be a little bit too thick, but that's okay. We're going to go ahead and move it to the top of his head before we can identify a few things that we might want to do. So there it is on the top of his head. You can even see in the perspective view. I believe I'm going to make that a lot thinner. So if you have some issues with scale, you can go to your Scale tool and scale it in the appropriate, and for me it's just in the Y-axis, but just scale it in the appropriate direction. Again, you're probably having a more difficult time than I am because you've probably, this is quite new to you. Okay, so that's that part of the hat. I think I'm going to angle it backwards a little bit. So if I go from my side view, I think I'll rotate this. Again, this is just optional, but I'm going to rotate it by, let's say 15 degrees, and then move it so it's on his head there. That looks kind of good. All right, next. I'm going to make the next part of the top hat, which is another cylinder. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller in circumference. Again, you might struggle with this part, which is totally fine. I'll make it quite tall. So there we go. You can see it from the front angle. You can see it from a variety of angles. I'm just going to go to my Move tool and move that guy up. Okay. In my case, it's probably a little bit wide. So if I scale it in my X and Y axis at one time, I can make it smaller. So there we go. Okay. I'm going to move it. And if you remember my previous angle that I angled this in was 15 degrees. So if I rotate this by 15 degrees, again, it's going to match, which is kind of nice. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and make those black just for the sake of making this kind of a classic snowman. All right, I think I won't do all of the rocks for the smile and for the eyes and buttons, etc. But I'll just do a couple of them to show you the idea here, and I'll focus on the arms because that'll be a little bit more tricky. So we've gotten to this point here. And let's go ahead and focus next on some of the pebbles. So if we go to, let's say, right here, I'm going to go from a top-down view, I can see that this is probably my smallest sphere. So if I go ahead and make another sphere for a pebble and maybe put it near the front of its face here, which again, some of you might have difficulty noticing where that is, but we can play around with it. Maybe in my front view, I can pull that guy up. And if I look at my perspective view, it always allows me to kind of see where it actually is. That's looking like a pretty good placement. I'm going to make it black as well. Okay, so there's a pebble eye. Maybe I'll push it back into his head a little bit more, which is easier from, in my case, from the side view. But you can see how that's impacted from my perspective view. All right, so let's go ahead and duplicate that across, and I'm going to have that the easiest from my front view. You might have a different view here. We're just going to duplicate it across, and you'll notice, there we go. We've got another eyeball on my snowman, and that was a nice, easy, slick, simple way of doing it. So you could imagine for his smile and for his buttons to do similar things. So I'm not going to go ahead and do those. I just want to focus on the nose and the arms, and then just challenge you to try some stuff on your own, okay? So the nose is a cone. It doesn't matter where you build it. I'm going to build it maybe in my perspective view. Maybe I'll make it the wrong size here. So it's generally going to be a cone. I'm going to go ahead and make a big, big carrot nose, and you'll have a fine time kind of figuring that out there. That won't be a problem. I'm going to make it orange. There we go, an orange nose. And then it's way too big, so I'm going to go ahead and scale it down. And maybe first of all, I'll scale it down completely, and maybe make it longer. So I'll pull it down or up in the Z-axis. So there we go. All right, so next, in my case, I'm going to go to my top view. Again, I find the top view really informative for a lot of my work. So there's the top view. It's probably still on the ground, so you can see right here it's kind of on the ground. So I'm going to pull it up into his face, and from the side view you can see the angle here isn't very good. So we can go ahead and go to the rotate tool and rotate that forwards and push it into his face. Now if you're still having issues, this is a pretty massive carrot, so if you wanted to, you could scale it downwards a bit so it didn't look so massive. Okay, and again, you can always double check in your perspective view, and this is looking pretty good. All right, lastly, let's go ahead and take a peek at the arms. Now, a few things about the arms you're going to want to know is you only actually need to make one stick. So we're going to go for arms that look like this. You only actually need to make one stick, and then you can duplicate and scale as you go. So you might have to delete along the way and just have some fun with it. But I'm going to go down to the side of my snowman, go to cylinder, make a thin stick from the top-down view, and then drag it up. And you can see from the side view here that that's looking pretty darn good. Again, if you need to scale it at any point in time, you go right ahead. You can pull out the scale tool if you need to make it shorter, longer, scale it down completely in all directions. You can do all of those things, okay? All right, so why I said that you only actually need to create one of these is we can just duplicate this guy. So I'm going to duplicate him and click OK and shorten him down, and that can be one of the fingers. Okay, to make the other finger, I can just duplicate that guy across. Okay, now I can go, so I've got two duplicates. I can go ahead and lift that guy up, maybe angle them a little bit. So I'm going to angle these maybe 45 degrees, maybe angle that guy 45 degrees, and then we can move them on in to the stick arm here. Okay, last thing I want to talk about here is duplicating objects and selecting objects. So if you want to duplicate the whole arm, you've got two choices. You can drag a box over all three objects. So if you drag a box even touching the three objects, it'll select the whole thing. And you may also want to be aware of grouping here. So you don't have to group, but if you want to make a group, when items are selected, there's a menu here called Group, where you can choose Group. And at that point in time, you can name it if you want to. I'm going to name it Arm. And you can see over here, I now have an arm group. If you ever want to ungroup, you can click on Group and go Ungroup. Okay? But essentially what I can do now is duplicate that arm. You'll notice the color isn't right. I can make it brown. I can do a variety of things and scale it down. I'm going to challenge you to do the rest on your own. But that's an introduction to the snowman. As you learn more modifiers, you may want to put a scarf on this snowman, make the scarf kind of curl around his body. You may want to do a variety of other things, make his arms kind of more crickety and bent, and you'll be learning that along the way.